And we are live. Good morning to everybody and welcome. We are live this morning on Behind the Markets. Welcome to the show where you get your regular fix of financial markets and everything to do with the capital markets altogether. I'm your host, Munyumba Mutwale. I will be joined later by my co-host, Stephanie Mutonga, who will be logging in from the main studio. And I think she's actually just chiming in right now. We'll just see if we can get a hold of her. And a good morning to you, Stephanie. How are you doing?
Give you the answers. So let's see Munyumba on the other side.
Good morning to you, Stephanie. We are live. And how are you doing? Okay, so we're just trying to patch into Stephanie, who's currently in the main studio right now. So we will be getting down to our main conversation today. We'll be talking a lot about the future of the African food system as we get
Right.
into the conversation. And a good morning to you, Stephanie. We are live, and how are you doing?
Good morning, Munyumba. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks, and welcome to our Futuristic Friday edition. Thank you, Stephanie. And how has your week been?
Well, my week has been okay. My week has been fine, I must say.
Okay, well, let's get down to today's conversation, which is, as I said, food security, the food system. And today we're just gonna take a slight deviation from the normal path because we are following quite an intensive conversation. And I actually wanted to share this one today to talk a lot about food. And I wanted to find out, do you think, and this is to everyone else, do you think we're making the most out of our food systems? Do you think we're making the most out of our food, our food industry? Or are we stuck in old ways? Do you think we need to innovate more when it comes to food? And I'm really bringing up this question because of what we call the Bloomberg New Africa Gateway. I think we've all been following every Friday. I've been discussing the the Bloomberg New Economy Africa Gateway Summit 2023 that was held in Morocco, and the different panel discussions that were happening there, because each of them actually has some policy prescriptions we should be looking at as a country, and also some innovative ways of thinking of the way we should be handling parts of our economy. I mean, we've talked about sports, we've talked about capital, we've talked about media, we talked about connectivity, we've talked about talent management, various things we should be doing to try and tap into each of us as a group. So today we'll be talking about the food sufficiency, sustainability, and profitability, which follows onto this main conversation. Now, the main questions that were being asked is Africa's long struggle with hunger, undernourishment, famine needs no introduction. We are pretty much the face of poverty and suffering around the world. Yet, after decades of the continent, we are no closer to food self-sufficiency, and the Russia-Ukraine war has made it even worse. In fact, what it's done is it's even exposed our problems. So Africa has the capacity to fertilize, grow, and process everything to feed itself. Okay, we have the biggest chunk of uncultivated land. The question is, what's missing? What's standing in the way? And that's a question I'd like to pose out to everybody. What is missing and what is standing in the way of us being able to feed ourselves? Because we are the biggest recipient of food packs around the world and food networks and any food support. We are the biggest recipients of it, yet we have the most farmland in the we are basically the most underutilized farmland. Stephanie, I don't know, maybe let me pose that question to you. What are your thoughts on it? What is the biggest challenge, do you think, to Africans feeding themselves or feeding ourselves? Okay, I think we may not have Stephanie at the moment, but let's quickly rush back in then. So this was I want to stop right here and start with the panel that was actually discussing this on the same the Africa Gateway panel. So you've got Fatimata Binta, who's the executive chef of Dine on a Mat, and the founder of the Fulani Kitchen Foundation. Then you also have Tatika Katipe, who is the chief operating officer of Degas Limited, who actually does a lot of support to small scale farmers. And you also have Sarah Menka, who is the the founder and chief executive of an artificial intelligence analytics firm that deals specifically in global agricultural supply chains and global farming information or global crop information called Grow Intelligence. It's actually one of the biggest things that you'll ever see, and it's actually something that we should be considering even getting in contact with as a country. So the reason I was really drawn to this panel, and I know a lot will fawn over the fact that it's all women. My biggest concern, my biggest actually draw into this panel is it's an actual supply chain of the food industry. This is the first time, I think, for me, we've actually seen an agriculture conversation that includes somebody in food processing and somebody in the actual food in the food preparation industry, even the restaurant industry, because a lot of the time we talk about farming from the production side. We never really have the time to sit down and talk about it from the consumption side. And I think this is why one of the things that really attracted me
Okay,
to
hopefully
watching
he's back.
attracted me to watching this conversation a lot more was the fact that we're going to be hearing a lot from a chef, while also hearing for somebody who's tracking the data on the full supply chain of agriculture, while simultaneously also getting some of the support for the small scale farmers. So this is a very, very holistic conversation that talks about the journey of food from farm to fork. We often just deal with food from farm to store. This is the problem with agricultural policy, especially a lot of it in Africa, from what I've seen, is that we never take this all the way to fork. And as to what we even should be, what changes we need to be making on the fork side of things and not just on the farm side of things. We're always talking about changing the farm. We never talk about changing the plate and the fork. And I love Fatimata's insights in this, because she actually gives a very good perspective on how we can actually reverse engineer a lot of the changes that we need to the farm sector. So going forward, so as I said, check out some of these names. These are actually quite interesting people. And I was really impressed by the conversation they had and also by some of the policy prescriptions. But let's get down to some of the data that also precedes this. 65...
over the past year have come off drastically since the start
of
the war.
We do have a little bit of a glitch that came there. But let's get back to the actual presentation. 65% of the world's uncultivated arable land is in Africa. This is according to the Africa Development Bank, and they actually had a study that came out in 2017, 2018, where 65% of the world's remaining uncultivated arable land. So in other words, the land that can be used for farming, but is not, 65% of it is found in Africa, yet we're starving. So this is where the issues always come with the conversation. Africa always has potential, but we always end at potential. That's always where the problem is. We always say Africa is gifted with natural resources, but it always ends at gifted with. It never ends with getting wealthy from. So that's where the problem always comes in. So here's a quick chart to also show when we're talking about food security, this is the price of milli meal. Historically, obviously, the one that's covered by the map is the current price. By the Money FM logo, is the current price. It's about 230. Okay, so we've gone from about 85 kwacha in 2016 to about 230 in terms of the actual price. And a lot of this has to do with integration of trying to participate in the regional markets of there. In fact, if you take a look even at inflation levels of breakfast meal, you can see that we've actually now jumped up to about 52% because we're in the middle of a regional food crisis where there is a lot of shortage of food around the continent. And Zambia seems to be one of the only few places that has food. So it's squeezing the price of grain up. Good for the person growing it, but obviously it's tough on the consumer, and we need to figure out how to balance the two. So let's get into the main conversation points that were actually being had here. So the first one I think that was asked was, what is the biggest challenge to food security and food sustainability in Africa? And all the panelists came up with these main issues. One is obviously climate change. The erratic weather has actually been rather been disruptive to the farmers. Think about the floods that we often face here. Think about the droughts that we've had to go through. Think about I won't say hurricane, but think about the major storm that swept through Mozambique and Malawi, which has left Malawi with barely any food, milli meal prices jumping through the sky, and Malawi basically trying to order maize from Zambia now, and we are also now feeding the pinch because Malawi also needs some of our food. So the reality now is, when we have those erratic weather swings, that's actually affecting a lot of agriculture, because there's a lot of natural agricultural processes that happen in Africa. There's also a lack of diversification in the types of foods we grow, we're also sticking to ancient crops without ever updating or upgrading them. There's too much emphasis on peasant or low or small scale farming. And we don't make our culture a priority in our food supply chain management. We really don't. And we also have high input costs. But however, the farm system is just a complicated, interconnected system. It is a highly complicated, interconnected system. I think for now we'll be just on hold for the moment. I know we will open up the phone lines at some point, but for now we'll just be making a presentation, and then we'll obviously open up to questions from people. The other thing I wanted to take in was the first point that was being made by one of the presenters. This is Fatoumata Binta, who's actually a renowned chef, and here she talks about the overemphasis on small-scale farming.
Stop overemphasizing on small-scale farming. We need to prepare for large-scale farming, because you look at most of these rural areas, or just farming in general, most of the, you find a lot of small-scale farmers, right, but there's not enough large-scale. So we're not thinking way ahead.
So I think that was the first point. And I think this is actually something I think a lot of us have actually pointed out, even with farmer input support, that it kind of keeps small-scale farmers at small scale, and rarely do we see it upgrade or upscale the farming industry. Now, one of the reasons this is important is because farm productivity is actually affected by this. In a discussion that was being had by the Ministry of Finance and also the manufacturing sector, in fact, an open conversation, the president of the Zambian Association of Manufacturers, came out and said, listen, one of the problems we're facing here is farm productivity, because he said, look, your peasant farmers are producing 33% per hectare or per acre of maize than your commercial farmers, but yet 95% of maize is being grown by the peasant farmers. So the least productive are growing the most essential crop, mainly because of political influence and political interference in the farming sector. So you can see that our emphasis on small-scale farming, part of it comes from the glorification, and I wish I could say this in a nicer way, but part of it comes from the fact that for some odd reason, educated people like glorifying poverty. We don't like to have the conversation of actually saying, how do we upscale and upgrade our farmers to become more mechanized, to become new age, to actually become bigger? How do we graduate people out of archaic methods of farming and into more modern forms of farming where we can increase the crop output? So we're finally having conversations about mechanization, graduating people out of farmer input support programs, because that has been one of the major problems, that we found people stuck in the farmer input support program. So we need to, and this is, I think there is a policy that's currently at work with this, where the comprehensive agricultural support, which is supposed to replace farmer input support, is supposed to aim to train, mechanize, and industrialize the small-scale farmers into larger or at least medium-sized farm estates so that they can increase their productivity, okay? You need the farmers to improve their efficiency and productivity, and part of that comes with scaling the farmers, not focusing on small-scale farmers. And this is affecting everyone, by the way, because we're not able to overproduce. So think about it, if you could replicate what was being said, we're possibly talking about tripling our crop output if we actually just produced most of it with larger farmers instead of all of it coming from small-scale farmers. But most of the larger farmers do not want to engage in things like maize, mainly because it's always politically involving. There's always, you're going to plant and then the government will get involved. Sorry, Stephanie, I think we're having a wild amount of interference coming in. I think we're just going to need to have to hold for a second there. Right. So now moving on to the next point that I think was being made was they said where the good starting point would be obviously training and mechanization. One interesting point that was made was educating farmers on the supply chain. Because interestingly, I'll tell you one of the difference I think anyone sees with commercial farmers and small scale farmers is commercial farmers know where their crop actually ends up, so they know the full value of their crop. If you don't know where your crop ends, you end up struggling to materialize or at least even understand the full value. So I think it's very important to educate the farmers on where their crop ends up and what is the value of that crop and even the margins and supply chains and some information. But it requires an education of not just knowing, let me farm and then get money. It's knowing where does my crop end? What is the end customer to my crop? Whose mouth does this end up in? And what do they pay to put that food in their mouth? I don't think we're sitting down and actually educating our farmers on understanding that where does their actual crop end up. And I think maybe it's also because of the simplicity of the crops they're always farming as well. Also not knowing that sometimes the maize they're farming is actually ending up in food in what's it called? In animal feed, which is much more higher premium than maize. So they sometimes need to understand where their food is ending up. And also there's always been a lack of trust between rural and urban or farm and urban. And there is a need to develop more of the local market when it comes to this. And we'll come to a point here carefully. Now, they also talked about scaling support for small scale farmers, which is now trying to get them into climate smart agriculture to help them access finance easier, because a lot more of the financing institutions are leaning more towards also having a climate impact. There's a lot more impact financing, which is set to bring prices down. So if you want to support farmers, then it's also important to bring in climate smart agriculture. But it's also one of the things that also needed to be taken into consideration is also the use of artificial intelligence to inform and inquire from farmers whatever is going on, actual proper interactions, USSD code conversations. There are applications that need to be developed to help with two-way communication and also data collection to help support the farm sector. This is where people like Grow Intelligence actually help. They help bring in a lot of predictive data to help support what the trajectory of farming is going to be. Regenerative agricultural practices to help support soil. Now, I've thrown in here that if you actually speak to the industrial hemp experts in Zambia, this is one of the things they've been calling for, that with the fusion of organic fertilizer plus hemp, actually can help regenerate the health of Zambian soil. Because that's one of the things we need to look at in terms of our fertilizer industry, and also traditional methods of soil regeneration. We need to also look into some of those as well. I don't know if we've managed to fix some of the sound issues that we're having from our main studio. Not at the moment. So going into it, this is some of the things that were being mentioned in terms of scaling support. So why is food security not improving? This is one of the things that was actually mentioned as well. One of the reasons food security has not seen signs of improvement has been the fact that interventions are only at small scale level. We're not really pushing a lot of interventions to graduate farmers out of small scale farmers. There has not been a comprehensive and harmonized ecosystem intervention where we take a look at the full ecosystem of food as opposed to just support for farming. Also, cost of capital in Africa is too high. Remember that farming needs support from finance. You need, if you look at the American government, they backstop loans, they backstop insurance for farmers. They've got programs that support these things very intensely. Yes, we do have farmer input support, but we're now starting to have farmer mechanization loans, which are coming out of the government. And this is where we need to start pressing the needle. And also the need for public-private partnership also stresses. And I think that's part of the farm block development, which is trying to work with the PPP model to help push farming up. So this is part of what was being subscribed on the same panel. An example they gave of commercial development of a country that did it without too much government intervention. The American government does get heavily involved in agriculture, but in Brazil, it was the commercial sector. The government's main investment was in soil replenishment, and the government also invests in research and development. So they said if your government is in debt, then where they can focus their attention is soil and R&D, as they did in Brazil, to try and help. Ethiopia has also been one of the models which has actually helped, which has actually seen a lot of the core crop yields also increase continuously. Yeah, sure. I think we can take a caller from the studio, but let's see if we actually have the sound to actually help with that. Let's see if, I don't know, Stephanie, you're saying we have a caller? Unfortunately, we cannot hear the people from the studio right now because of the sound situation, and therefore I will not be able to also hear the caller from my side. Yeah, unfortunately, we're gonna have to just proceed from there. I think what the best thing they're gonna do is hopefully our team can help just type the message into our chat so that we can actually figure out. Let's continue from this side. Right. Part of what we've also been talking about, and I'll just be saying, part of what we also saw is that there also is a need. There also was a call for a Pan-African approach, and I think this is one of the more innovative parts of the conversation. There was a call for a Pan-African approach to agriculture. And what there was a call from, and this came from Sarah Menke, who talked about stopping food nationalism and also trying to divide the farming responsibilities around African countries and also help support free trade infrastructure, but really looking at an African vision. So here's what she actually started to write out, and I want to share what she said. It's very important about having a Pan-African approach to food security, as opposed to each nation driving its own food security. Here's what she talks about. Instead of saying, you grow this, you grow this, you grow this, let's combine all our food together and let's feed each other.
What does that mean then for countries that are, already heavily indebted, as you mentioned? Investors are already risk averse to going in and investing in, a Ghana or a Zimbabwe or something like that. I mean, should they be trying to replicate some of the policy framework that Ethiopia did, or should there be another approach?
I think there needs to be a Pan-African approach that's different than the version that we have today. Today you have this idea of food security where every African country is trying to be self-sufficient on its own for its own thing, as opposed to thinking of food security for the continent, and then sort of playing on the relative strengths of different countries to say, how do we become food secure as a continent? But that means things like free trade agreements that are being signed actually functioning. It means being able to go from point A to point B easily and seamlessly. I mean, as an African, it's harder for me to travel within Africa than it is for me to travel, in Europe or in other parts of the world. We need to solve for those types of things. And then I would say there needs to be a Pan-African vision for agriculture, because each country going at it, for itself is going to make it ultimately way more expensive than saying, what is each country's relative strengths? What are the real investment opportunities that exist for agriculture in Tanzania versus in Ghana versus in Ethiopia versus in South Africa? They actually look different. And then how do we set up the right market mechanisms to ensure when we're talking about food security that sort of becomes a uniting factor? The African Union today doesn't have that thing that binds it the way that its original institution, the OAU, which is the Organization of African Unity, had, which was decolonizing Africa. Like, can food security become that thing that our African leaders can come across the table on and actually structurally change things? I hope so, because if we don't, then I don't think each country going about it on its own is going to solve it.
So that's a different approach. However, that's not going to be popular with a lot of us, because that's also what's causing a lot of the food price inflation. We're attempting to do this right now. We're attempting to actually now start feeding our continent. And one of the side effects is, yes, you've got you're going to have more future profitability in the farm sector, because already you're hearing Tanzania wants 1 million tons from you. Kenya wants 1 million tons from you. Malawi wants 1 million tons from you. DRC wants food from you. Zimbabwe wants food from you. Angola wants food from you. Got 6 countries asking for huge amounts of maize from Zambia, while we're only producing about less than 4 million tons, just enough to feed ourselves and our family. So this requires that we need to ramp up production about 2 to 3 times just to be able to meet our needs while also meeting the regional needs and being able to then triple our revenue from our farm sector. That is an opportunity that we need to tap into, but it requires mechanization, industrialization. It requires moving away from small scale farming and shifting people into larger scale farming and using a much stronger data and analysis system to support the farm sector. So that's some of the policy that we actually have to look at. And then on top of that, it's going to require us stomaching inflation for a little bit, because if we're going to try and organize ourselves as Africans, we're also going to have to try and, one, harmonize our currencies while also operating together to say, you grow this, you grow this, you grow this. You're good with tea, you're good with rice, you're good with this. Why don't we all grow each other's food, put it in the middle, and then start selling it to one another? We just need that trade center. That's what she's talking about, a full trade infrastructure for food specifically, and a vision of who can grow what. Because one of the things that helps with countries like America is they know who grows what in what region, and it trades across the country seamlessly. That's what's needed here. We need to know who grows what as a continent, and it trades across the continent seamlessly. That's where the problems are coming. Getting food from one place to another is also a very difficult venture. And as she talked about, it's easier to travel abroad than it is to travel within the continent, because the travel infrastructure is horrible already. So these are the things that we need to look at developing, but it requires a united Pan-African vision approach to start saying we all need to come together to grow together, as opposed to the backstabbing approach that's been going on for quite some time. Part of also what we also need, and this is one of the things the chef Fatima Binta also said, is that you also need to decolonize African, decolonize African eating. And she talks about the fact that there is a need to decolonize the perception of fine dining across African eating. And that's another thing that we need to start looking at as well. And I think, Eugene, somebody has pointed out here something that's quite interesting. In the long term, there's an opportunity for maize in SADC, like we've seen recently. Here's the sad thing about Zambia. Next door is Botswana, one of the biggest beef producers or beef cattle farmers in our continent, or at least one of the most prolific ones. There's Botswana right next door, who's got a lot of beef. They export beef to the UK. We import beef from Brazil. How on earth did this end up happening? How does Botswana beef skip Zambia and go all the way to the UK? And how does Zambia get to South Africa and also get to Brazil? How did we get to this situation where our next door neighbor, we're not getting any beef from them, or any cattle from them, whichever? But so these are the issues that we need to also work out as a country. So yes, in the long term, we need to start looking at making sure we have integrated food solutions as a continent. But she also talked about decolonizing the mind of the African food consumer. That's actually quite interesting. So listen to what she has to say.
It means also is we should eat at home. And when I mean eat at home, it means in the continent we should eat what's local. Because most of the foods that are very expensive are foods that are imported. And also mindset shift is very important. Decolonize mindsets. Because for me as a chef, one thing I've experienced, people glorifies going to dine out in an Italian restaurant for a lack of, it's not like I love Italian food, and also not exploring our food enough. They don't see it as cool to go to an African restaurant to have a fine dining experience. So really placing value on what's local, I think is very important when it comes to stepping forward.
So
one of the things there that needs to be talked about is that we attach fine dining as Africans to foreign food and not to our local. African food, sometimes, yes, it can be considered fine dining, but in the larger extent, it's considered street food. And that's where the problem comes down to. So it's always going to fetch a lower price. Our local crops and our local grains and our local recipes are always going to fetch the lowest price because they only exist in the street food category. Now, yes, there's still a lot of demand there, but their margins, the pricing margins are always going to be lower. So until we put a premium, and that's a mindset change she's talking about, until the African eater can see a class and a regalness to local food, unfortunately, we'll never be able to have the right crop profits for us to be able to farm a lot of our traditional foods as well. Added to this, they did also discuss the conversation of global community support, that we do need to improve the look of farming and marketing of farming in Africa to do that. But then also Fatoumata Binta also talked about the need for innovation in the farm sector, in the food sector. And I want to circle on this point for a little bit. It's actually quite interesting, because what she talked about was the fact that there's a lot of stiffness in our food production, and there's a lot of sticking to the way we've been producing things. So she actually gives an example and says one of the biggest problems why Africans don't innovate with their traditional food, and we need to do this. I'd love to see a MasterChef kind of TV show which challenges us now with our local foods to start to now create a lot more variety in here, so that we can actually create some sort of uptown experience with our own local foods or our traditional foods. The reason I'm saying this is because we tried this experiment a while back, where we actually were working with a couple of chefs to come up with an idea of how you could actually work out different meals. And we did a food testing once where we had a Caribbean chef. And one of the reasons why we had to have a Caribbean chef is because Africans as people, we are too emotionally invested in the way food was prepared, and that we almost hear the voice of our elders saying, you can't cook nshima on a stove. You have to cook that on a brazier. So even the way it's prepared, what's prepared, how it's prepared, we're very strict about the way this is. So we need some sort of outside influence to try and help us be more creative. The outside influence has always brought their food in. We've never really had the outside influence to spark creativity. So this Caribbean chef produced what we call traffic light in Shima, where the gentleman created a red lump where he infused chili into a lump of nshima, he infused okra into a lump of nshima, and he infused curry into a lump of nshima. And it was about 3 different colors. It was a technicolor experience of actually seeing nshima. The guy actually went in and created various things. He created a sauce out of chibuku. He actually created a dipping sauce. He created vitumbua infused with chicken in it and also with shredded fish in it. I've never tasted stuff like this before, but it felt uptown. It was a different experience to what we're actually seeing. The guy even made a cocktail out of chibuku, which actually tasted, which was infused with chocolate and coffee. That level of experimentation with our traditional foods and traditional cuisines is what we need to start doing to upgrade them, to give them the premium model pricing that can actually allow some of these crops to now get enticed into the farm sector. So this is why I said having a chef in the conversation can actually improve the view and the innovation of what needs to be done. So here's one of the conversation. Here's what she talks about when she says innovating with some of the foods themselves.
Different cultures and sort of take this approach. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so for me, it's really about promoting African gastronomy to start with, because I believe my dining concept, my restaurant, is a vehicle to actually champion change, in my community. So, for example, if a diner comes to my restaurant, I'm telling the stories, I'm giving them knowledge about grains that they're supposed to use more. I'm sharing recipes. And also a lot of collaborations around the world with other chefs from East, West, South, even chefs outside of the continent. Something I usually do is I take ingredients with me. So key ingredients like fonio, like millet. When I'm collaborating, some of the chefs are Michelin star chefs. I will give them as a gift, and I'll challenge them that create a recipe. Because for them, they don't have any emotional attachment or grandmother's recipes or rules to it, and they are very creative. They have a way more modern approach to ingredients, so they'll come up with very interesting things like fonio crackers, millet bread, millet ice cream, and that sparks conversation. Because when you share that on platforms, you add that to your menu, people are curious, like, oh, so there's a way I can actually use fonio without just sticking to the traditional way. Honestly, even said, I was shocked that wheat, honestly, even as a chef, I didn't know that wheat was coming from Ukraine. And then there was shortage. We needed to bake bread. And luckily, that time also, I launched the Global Chef Challenge with FAO, because you know they designated the entire 2023 to use more of millets. So we did this challenge. A lot of chefs were trying millet in different ways. And I tried to use fonio and millet to bake bread. It came out really nice. And for me, the question was, why is it that these are ancient grains that's been around for over 7,000 years? Most is gluten-free, very nutritious. Why?
So, and I think just to wind it up, today in the food security conversation, and sorry, I think we've just had sound problems from the main studio. Just to kind of wind it up, one of the main things that we should be looking at in order to help support the food sector, and judging by this conversation, is we also need to look at the food consumption side. We're always talking about innovating in the food production side, the food consumption side. I've seen a Zambian company who has gone as far as creating cassava crisps, where people can actually, it's the same as a packet of chips that we have made from potatoes, but these ones are made from cassava. So this is a different way of trying to look at how to repackage, remold, and bring in a lot more so that we can increase the demand and increase the different use cases for a lot of our crops, our traditional crops, then to try and help diversify the actual crops that we're using in our country. There was a very broad conversation. I'd really encourage you to go and see it. It's on YouTube, on Bloomberg New Economy YouTube channel, and it was called Food Security, creating a sustainable food system. And it was an all-women panel, but what I really loved is we were sitting down talking from the supply chain side, from the farm side, but also we were talking about from the fork, where the food ends up. And it's very important for us to really speak about farming from the perspective of where the food is ending up. Because when you start to do that, and if you start to innovate in how the food ends up, then that's also good. So some of the policy, one of the innovative things I think that came to my mind is we do need to promote and encourage a lot more creativity in food production. There is a culture of stiffness that we have as Africans. We are really stiff when it comes to food and how we touch our food. It must be produced the exact same way, in the exact same quantities that it was done in 15 Chakuti before the white man even came to Africa. That may be something we need to start relooking. And there are some chefs, thank goodness, who are starting to challenge things and starting to come out. And in the world of social media, I would like to see a lot more of the culinary experts really coming out and challenging it. Because yes, food is dear to our culture. When people get married, they're taught to make food the way it was made back then. And they're told if you don't make it that way, you're insulting your ancestors. But we do need to start being a bit more adventurous with the way we produce our food. And that may give a lot more of the diversification opportunities, but also we need to be more Pan-African in the way we trade our food. And we need to start having a lot more cultural exchange in food, in the food sector. So I think one of the missing voices to the farming and agricultural conversation has been the culinary industry. They have been the missing voice, because if we can get them in the rooms, then we can actually maybe have a little bit of a more innovative way of actually trying to produce. Because that lady was talking about producing bread with different kinds of crops, and now having ancient grains which are locally produced, as opposed to sitting there waiting for wheat to come in from the Baltics, from Eastern Europe. That's one of the conversations that we're having today about food security. Please go and check it out. I'll be posting some of this for everyone. I wish you all a wonderful week. To my co-host who's actually been in the studio, unfortunately, like I said, sound has not been our friend. Stephanie, I wish you and everyone on that side a good and wonderful, prosperous day. Have a blessed weekend. And to all, have a wonderful day.